The man had shot someone in the face while ordering a drink, didn't run, didn't hide, just finished his beer, stepped over the body, and walked out into the London night like he'd done nothing more interesting than light a cigarette. And when he died 30 years later, 20,000 people showed up to cry. March 1995. A hearse rolls through the streets of East London, and the city holds its breath. Thousands of people line the pavements, not hiding, not ashamed. They're weeping openly, throwing flowers onto the road, pressing against barriers just to catch a glimpse of the coffin. Police estimate the crowd at somewhere between 20 and 30,000. The procession stretches for miles. 26 black limousines follow behind. The floral tributes alone cost more than most people earn in a year. And here's the thing that should make you pause. The man inside that coffin was a certified paranoid schizophrenic, a convicted murderer who shot a man in the head in front of a crowded pub and didn't even flinch, a gangster who ran protection rackets, ordered beatings, and built an empire on fear so absolute that witnesses refused to speak for over a decade. He spent his final years locked inside Broadmoor, Britain's most notorious psychiatric hospital. His name was Ronnie Kray, and London mourned him like a king. This isn't a story about a criminal who fooled people. It's not about Stockholm Syndrome or manipulation or some grand deception. The people crying in those streets knew exactly who Ronnie was. They knew about the murders. They knew about the violence. They'd lived alongside it for years, and they showed up anyway. So here's the question that should genuinely unsettle you. How does a madman become a comfort? How does a killer become beloved? And what does it say about us, about all of us, that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is also the one who makes us feel safe? The answer isn't simple. It involves a diagnosis that should have ended everything, a wall of silence that protected a monster, and a city so desperate for order that it found it in chaos itself. It involves politicians with secrets, police on payrolls, and a community that chose a devil they knew over an uncertainty they couldn't bear. But that wasn't even the strangest part. The strangest part was that Ronnie Kray's madness wasn't a flaw in his operation, it was the foundation. His unpredictability, his paranoia, his complete detachment from the rules that govern normal human behavior, these weren't obstacles to his power, they were the source of it. And the people of East London figured that out long before the historians did. To understand how a certified lunatic became the closest thing London's underworld ever had to a king, we need to go back to the beginning, back to a pair of identical twins born into poverty, violence, and a world that was about to tear itself apart. What happened next would reshape an entire city's relationship with crime, with madness, and with the uncomfortable truth about what people really want when they say they want to feel safe. Hoxton, East London, 1933. The Kray twins enter the world 7 minutes apart, and the doctors immediately notice something unusual. Reggie comes out first, healthy and calm. Ronnie follows behind, smaller, weaker, struggling to breathe. He nearly dies in his first hour of life. Some people later said that explained everything, that Ronnie spent the rest of his days trying to prove he wasn't the weak one, that every act of violence was compensation for those first desperate minutes when his brother was already thriving and he was fighting just to exist. Maybe that's too neat, but something was different about Ronnie from the start. The East End they grew up in was a brutal place, poverty everywhere, families crammed into tiny flats with no running water, men drinking away what little money they had, while women held everything together through sheer force of will. The Krays' father, Charlie, was a deserter, in and out of their lives, unreliable in every way that mattered. Their mother, Violet, became the center of their universe. She worshipped those boys, protected them, told them they were special when the world told them they were nothing. That devotion would last until the day she died, and some say it created monsters. By their teenage years, the twins had discovered something they were genuinely good at: fighting. They became amateur boxing champions, feared in every gym across the East End. But while Reggie fought with precision and control, Ronnie fought with something else entirely: rage. A kind of fury that didn't stop when the bell rang. Trainers noticed he had trouble knowing when a fight was over. He'd keep swinging when his opponent was already down. There was a blankness in his eyes that unsettled people who'd seen plenty of violence in their lives. At 17, the twins were called up for national service. They lasted almost no time at all, went absent without leave on their first day, then again and again after that. They assaulted a police officer who came to arrest them. They ended up in military prison, then civilian prison, cycling through the system like it was a revolving door. But here's what matters. Prison didn't break them, it educated them. Inside, they met the men who ran London's underworld: armed robbers, gangsters, fixers who knew how to turn violence into money. The twins paid attention, learned the structure of organized crime, understood that brutality alone wasn't enough. You needed business sense, connections, a territory to control. When they got out, they took over a billiard hall in Bethnal Green. It was a shabby little place, barely worth noticing. Within months, it became the headquarters of an empire. The Krays started with protection. Pay us and nothing bad happens to your business. Stop paying and watch what we do. Simple, effective, as old as crime itself. But the twins added something new. They weren't just threatening violence, they were promising order. In a chaotic post-war London where petty criminals and rival gangs made life unpredictable, the Krays offered certainty. One boss, one set of rules, one phone call to make your problems disappear. People paid, gladly. By their mid-20s, Reggie and Ronnie controlled a significant piece of East London. They owned clubs, they had police officers taking monthly envelopes, they mixed with celebrities, boxers, actors who found their danger exciting. The newspapers started calling them the most powerful gangsters in Britain. But underneath the success, something was fracturing inside Ronnie's mind. The mood swings had always been there, but now they were getting worse. Paranoia that made him suspect everyone, including his own brother. Grandiose beliefs that he was destined for something historic. Dark periods where he wouldn't speak for days, followed by manic bursts of energy where he'd make reckless decisions that nearly destroyed everything they'd built. Reggie covered for him, made excuses, cleaned up the messes, but he knew something was wrong, something beyond the normal pressures of their life, something that couldn't be fixed with money or muscle. In 1958, Ronnie was arrested again and sent to prison, and this time, behind those walls, the thing that had been building inside him finally broke through. What happened next should have ended the Kray empire forever. Instead, it made Ronnie more powerful than he'd ever been. Inside Wandsworth Prison, Ronnie Kray stopped making sense. He'd always been volatile, unpredictable, but this was something else entirely. He started talking to people who weren't there, became convinced that other prisoners were plotting against him, that the guards were agents sent to destroy him specifically. He stopped eating, certain the food was poisoned. He attacked inmates for looking at him the wrong way, then couldn't remember doing it. The prison authorities didn't know what to do with him. This wasn't normal criminal behavior. This was something breaking apart inside a man's skull. In 1958, Ronnie Kray was certified insane, paranoid schizophrenia. The diagnosis came with a transfer to Longgrove Psychiatric Hospital in Surrey, a grim Victorian institution where Britain locked away the people it didn't know how to fix. The expectation was simple. Ronnie Kray's criminal career was finished. You don't run an empire from inside a mental asylum. You don't give orders when you can't tell the difference between a hallucination and a conversation. Reggie visited as often as they'd let him, watched his twin deteriorate under heavy medication, saw the vacant stare, the shuffling walk, the brother he'd known since the womb disappearing into a chemical fog. And Reggie made a decision. He was getting Ronnie out, whatever it took. What happened next has been disputed for decades. The most persistent story, the one that became legend, is that Reggie exploited their identical appearance. He visited Ronnie, swapped clothes with him, and walked out of Longgrove wearing his brother's patient uniform, while Ronnie strolled through the front gate in Reggie's suit. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Ronnie was back in London. Some historians doubt this version. They say the security at Longgrove wasn't tight enough to require such dramatics, that Ronnie was simply released or transferred, and the switch story was invented later to burnish the myth. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What matters isn't how Ronnie escaped the asylum. What matters is what he became after. Because Ronnie Kray came back different. The medication had stabilized something in him, at least temporarily, but it had also removed whatever thin membrane had existed between his impulses and his actions. The Ronnie who returned to London streets was calmer in some ways, more deliberate, but he was also utterly without hesitation. The paranoia remained, the grandiose beliefs intensified. He now spoke openly about his destiny, compared himself to figures like Al Capone and Hitler, saw himself as a man marked for historical significance. And here's the twist that nobody expected. His madness made him more effective. Before the breakdown, Ronnie had been dangerous but somewhat predictable. Rivals could anticipate his moves, negotiate with him, find ways to coexist. After Longgrove, that calculus disappeared entirely. Nobody knew what Ronnie would do next. Nobody could guess what imagined slight might trigger extreme violence. Nobody could reason with a man whose reasoning operated on an entirely different plane. Ronnie was the businessman, smart, strategic, capable of charm when charm was needed. Ronnie was something else. Ronnie was the threat that made the business possible, the shadow behind every negotiation, the answer to the question that every rival asked themselves: what happens if we say no? What happened was Ronnie. The brothers developed a system. Reggie handled the day-to-day operations, the club management, the careful cultivation of police and politicians. Ronnie handled the fear. He became the weapon that Reggie could deploy without ever having to give an explicit order. Problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation got handed to Ronnie, and Ronnie solved them in ways that nobody wanted to discuss afterward. Witnesses from that era describe a strange phenomenon. Ronnie could walk into a room and the temperature would drop. Conversations would stop. Hard men who'd spent their lives around violence would find excuses to leave. It wasn't just that he was capable of terrible things, it was that you could see in his eyes that the normal calculations didn't apply. Cost-benefit analysis meant nothing to a man who genuinely believed he was destined for greatness, and that anyone who stood in his way was an obstacle to history itself. The psychiatric diagnosis should have finished him. Instead, it became his greatest asset. By the early 1960s, the Kray empire had expanded beyond anything London had seen before. Clubs, gambling operations, protection rackets spanning the entire East End and creeping into the West. Celebrities photographed with the twins at their establishments, politicians accepting invitations to their parties, an aura of untouchability that seemed to grow stronger with every passing year. And at the center of it all, holding everything together through sheer terror, was a man who had been officially declared unfit for normal society. But Ronnie wasn't satisfied with power alone. He wanted respect. He wanted recognition. And in 1966, he decided to make a statement so bold, so public, so utterly insane that no one would ever question his supremacy again. What he did next shocked even the people who thought they knew him. March 9th, 1966. The Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel. George Cornell was drinking alone at the bar, listening to the jukebox play a Walker Brothers song when Ronnie Kray walked through the door. Cornell looked up, saw who it was. According to witnesses, he smirked and said something dismissive. Some accounts claim he called Ronnie a fat poof. Others say he simply laughed. It was the last thing he ever did. Ronnie pulled out a 9mm Mauser, crossed the room without hurrying, and shot Cornell directly in the head. The bullet entered just above his right eye. Cornell collapsed off his bar stool. The music kept playing. Ronnie stood there for a moment, perfectly calm, then turned and walked back out into the night. The pub had customers. The barmaid was standing right there. People saw everything, and yet when police arrived, nobody had seen anything at all. The barmaid suddenly couldn't remember who had been drinking that night. The customers had all been in the toilet, apparently, at the exact moment the shot was fired. An entire pub full of witnesses became an entire pub full of amnesia. This is what made Ronnie Kray different from every other gangster in London. It wasn't just the willingness to kill. Plenty of criminals had killed before. It was the willingness to kill like this, in public, in front of witnesses, without a mask, without an alibi, without any apparent concern for consequences. Rational criminals plan murders carefully. They choose isolated locations. They dispose of bodies. They create distance between themselves and the act. Ronnie did the opposite. He wanted people to see. He wanted them to know exactly who had pulled the trigger and understand that it didn't matter. Because what could they do about it? This is where his madness transformed into strategy. A sane gangster could be outmaneuvered. You could gather evidence against him. You could turn his associates. You could find the weakness in his operation and exploit it. But Ronnie had no weaknesses in the conventional sense. He genuinely didn't process consequences the way other people did. The possibility of prison, even execution, didn't factor into his calculations because those calculations weren't happening in the first place. He operated on instinct and delusion. He believed he was untouchable because destiny had marked him for greatness. And the terrifying thing was, that belief became self-fulfilling. When you act like consequences don't exist, people start to believe they don't exist for you. When witnesses see you commit murder in broad daylight and walk free, they understand something fundamental about how power actually works. The wall of silence that protected the Krays wasn't built on loyalty. It was built on a very simple equation. Talk, and Ronnie will find you. Ronnie, the man who shot George Cornell in a crowded pub and finished his drink afterward. Ronnie, who they say smiled while he did it. What jury would convict when every potential witness knew what happened to people who talked? Scotland Yard was paralyzed. They knew the Krays were guilty of countless crimes. They had informants who would whisper names and dates off the record. But the moment anything approached an official statement, memories failed, stories changed, witnesses disappeared, or suddenly remembered they'd been somewhere else entirely. Detective after detective took runs at the twins. All of them hit the same wall. It wasn't that evidence didn't exist. It was that evidence required people willing to stand up in court and speak, and nobody was willing to stand up against Ronnie Kray. His reputation grew with each failed investigation, every detective who walked away empty-handed, every case that collapsed before trial, every newspaper article that hinted at crimes everyone knew about but nobody could prove. The myth became larger than the man. And Ronnie fed that myth deliberately. He cultivated an image that was part businessman, part monster. He'd show up at charity events, donate money to hospitals, buy drinks for entire pubs. Then he'd order someone's fingers broken for a minor slight. The unpredictability was the point. You never knew which Ronnie you were going to get, the generous host or the man with the empty eyes and the gun. Some historians argue that Ronnie wasn't strategic at all, that his mental illness simply manifested in ways that happened to benefit his criminal enterprise. They say we've imposed a logic onto his behavior that never actually existed. Maybe they're right. Maybe Ronnie Kray was just a broken man who stumbled into power because his particular form of brokenness happened to terrify people effectively. But here's what complicates that interpretation. The East End didn't just fear Ronnie Kray, they protected him, and not because they had to. When detectives came asking questions, residents didn't just stay silent out of terror. Many of them actively lied to protect the twins. They provided alibis. They misdirected investigations. They treated the Krays like family members who needed shielding from outside interference. The same man who murdered George Cornell in public was also the man who paid for local funerals, who gave money to families struggling through hard times, who settled neighborhood disputes with a kind of brutal fairness that the courts never provided. The monster was also a protector. The madman was also a pillar of the community. And that contradiction explains more about Ronnie Kray's power than any psychiatric diagnosis ever could.
Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. The East End genuinely loved the Krays, not in a coerced way, not because they had to. They loved them the way you love a difficult family member who causes problems but always shows up when it matters. Ronnie understood something instinctive about community. He grew up poor. He never forgot it. When local families couldn't afford to bury their dead, Ronnie paid for the funerals. When kids needed money for school trips, it appeared. When elderly neighbors had trouble with landlords or debt collectors, one phone call made the problem vanish. He remembered names, asked about children, showed up at weddings and christenings like a benevolent uncle. This wasn't cynical calculation, or if it was so deeply ingrained that it looked identical to genuine care. Ronnie saw himself as the protector of his people, the king of his territory, and kings, in his mind, had responsibilities to their subjects. The result was a strange social contract. The Krays took from businesses, yes, they demanded tribute from anyone making money in their domain, but they also provided something the authorities never could: order, predictability, a phone number to call when something went wrong. Post-war East London was chaotic, petty criminals everywhere, random violence, a police force that residents viewed with suspicion and contempt. The Krays offered an alternative justice system, swift, decisive, brutal when necessary, but consistent. You knew where you stood with the twins. You couldn't say that about the courts. And then there was Ronnie's sexuality. In an era when homosexuality was illegal in Britain, when men went to prison for loving other men, Ronnie Kray was openly gay. He didn't hide it. He introduced boyfriends to his mother. He held court in clubs surrounded by young men and dared anyone to comment. This should have made him vulnerable. In the hyper-masculine world of organized crime, any perceived weakness got exploited. But Ronnie transformed potential weakness into dominance. He was gay, yes. He was also the most terrifying man in London. Anyone who thought those two things contradicted each other found out quickly how wrong they were. Some researchers have noted the strange progressivism of this, a working-class criminal living authentically decades before society caught up. Others point out the violence that accompanied it. Ronnie assaulted men who made jokes at his expense. His acceptance of his own sexuality didn't extend to tolerating disrespect. But the larger point remains. Ronnie Kray lived outside every rule. Legal rules, social rules, criminal rules. He made his own world and forced everyone around him to inhabit it. The most disturbing aspect of his popularity wasn't the fear, it was the genuine affection. People who'd had every reason to hate him didn't. Old women who'd watched him grow up spoke of him fondly until they died. Men who'd been threatened by him bought drinks in his memory. The funeral crowds weren't performing grief, they were expressing something real. How do you explain that? How do you reconcile the murderer with the mourners? Maybe the answer is that people don't want justice, not really. They want someone in charge, someone who makes the chaos make sense, someone who punishes the people who deserve punishing and rewards the people who stay loyal. They want a king, even a mad one, especially a mad one. Because a mad king can do what a sane one can't. He can break the rules that everyone else follows and make you feel like you're part of something special for being under his protection. Ronnie Kray gave the East End an identity, us against them, the locals against the outsiders, the real people against the authorities who never cared about them anyway. That identity outlasted his crimes, it outlasted his imprisonment, it outlasted his life. But in 1967, the empire finally began to crack, and it started with a murder that even Ronnie couldn't walk away from.
Jack the Hat McVitie was a small-time crook with a big mouth. He'd taken money from the Krays to kill someone and never followed through. Worse, he'd been talking, saying things about the twins, disrespecting them publicly. In October 1967, Ronnie decided Jack needed to go. The murder was messy. Unlike the clinical execution of George Cornell, this one happened at a basement flat in Stoke Newington. Reggie was supposed to shoot McVitie, but the gun jammed. What followed was brutal. McVitie was stabbed repeatedly in the face, throat and stomach. The body was never found. But this time, the wall of silence had cracks. Detective Leonard Nipper Reed had been hunting the Krays for years, obsessively. He understood that the key wasn't finding evidence. Evidence existed everywhere. The key was finding people willing to talk. And by 1968, the twins had made enough enemies that whispers started becoming statements. Former associates facing their own charges saw an opportunity, trade the Krays for reduced sentences. One talked, then another. The wall that had held for a decade began to crumble. On May 8, 1968, police arrested both twins simultaneously, afraid that if they took one, the other would disappear. The trial at the Old Bailey became a sensation. Witness after witness finally said out loud what everyone had known for years. The jury convicted them of murder. The judge handed down life sentences with a minimum of 30 years. At the time, it was the longest sentence ever given for murder at the Old Bailey. Ronnie was sent to prison, then quickly transferred to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, back to where the system believed he belonged. This time, there would be no escape. But the myth didn't care about prison walls. From inside Broadmoor, Ronnie held court.
He gave interviews to journalists, received celebrity visitors. His face appeared on magazine covers. Books were written about him while he was still alive to read them. He became larger in captivity than he'd ever been on the streets. The 1990 film The Krays turned the brothers into cultural icons. Suddenly, a new generation knew their names. The violence became legend. The brutality became folklore. When Ronnie died of a heart attack in March 1995, the funeral proved what imprisonment had failed to diminish. Those crowds weren't mourning a prisoner, they were mourning a king. The myth continues to grow. The 2015 film, Legend, introduced the Krays to yet another generation. Documentaries dissect their psychology. Internet forums debate their legacy. Were they monsters or Robin Hoods, psychopaths or products of their environment? The questions don't have clean answers. That's why people keep asking them.
So how does a certified madman become a city's strange comfort? Maybe the answer is simpler than we want it to be. People don't crave safety, they crave certainty. They want someone in charge, even if that someone is terrifying, especially if that someone is terrifying. Ronnie Kray offered the East End something the police never could: predictable unpredictability. A devil they understood, a monster who remembered their names and paid for their funerals and made the chaos of post-war London feel like it had a shape. His madness wasn't a bug, it was the feature. The very thing that should have destroyed him became the source of his power. Because you can negotiate with a rational man, you can predict him, outmaneuver him. But a man who genuinely believes he's destined for greatness, a man who shoots someone in a crowded pub and orders another drink, that man becomes a legend. The most unsettling part isn't that London feared Ronnie Kray, it's that London needed him, and when he died, they mourned him like they'd lost something precious. What does that say about power, about community, about the dark things we're willing to accept in exchange for feeling like someone's in control? Those questions don't have comfortable answers. Maybe that's why we're still asking them 60 years later. If this story got under your skin, subscribe for more. We dig into the cases that history tried to bury and the truths that still disturb. See you in the next one.